Hi everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why some people are super into politics, and others just don't seem to care, and what difference that really makes? Well, this new study dives deep into that very question, looking at political interest not just as a feeling, but as something more like a team you belong to. It is something we often think about when we talk about who votes, who knows about current events, and who feels like they have a say in how things are run. But researchers have noticed that not everyone is equally interested in politics, and this creates what they call a democratic divide. The problem is, even though it is so important, scientists haven't quite agreed on what political interest actually is. Is it just curiosity? Is it excitement? Is it a mix of things? This lack of a clear definition makes it hard to figure out why some people are interested, and others aren't, and even harder to encourage more people to get involved in a way that feels fair for everyone. That is where this new research comes in with a really interesting idea. What if political interest or disinterest is actually a kind of social identity? Think about it like belonging to a sports fan group or a music fan base. You identify with it, it shapes how you see yourself and others, and it can even influence your behavior. This study wanted to see if political interest works the same way. They propose it can be a positive identity, meaning you feel good about being interested in politics, or a negative identity, where you define yourself by not being interested in politics, perhaps in opposition to those who are. To test this big idea, the researchers created two new ways to measure this social identity. They called them the Positive Political Interest Identity Scale, or PPIs, and the Negative Political Interest Identity Scale, or NPIs. They used these scales with over 1,500 people in the Netherlands. They did something called a split-half approach, where they used one half of the data to explore how the scales worked, and then the other half to confirm their findings. This is a super careful way to make sure the results are solid. So, what is construct validity? Basically, it's asking, do these scales actually measure what they're supposed to measure? Do they really capture this idea of political interest as a social identity? They used a fancy statistical method called item response theory, or IRT, to check this. Imagine IRT as a smart way to figure out if each question in their survey is actually contributing to measuring the underlying concept of political identity. They wanted to make sure the items were good at telling apart people with different levels of this identity. After running their tests, they found that their scales were pretty good. Different questions on the scale were effective at picking up on people's different levels of identifying with being politically interested or uninterested. They looked at something called discrimination parameters, which in simple terms show how well a question can tell the difference between people who score high and low on the scale. Most of the questions did a good job, meaning the scales were likely measuring the intended identity. They said, our items are good at measuring the intended latent concept, indicating that disinterest can be measured as a social identity, and therefore find evidence in favor of H1. This is great news because it supports their main idea that political disinterest can be thought of as a social identity. But just showing that you can measure something as a social identity isn't enough. The real test is, does this identity actually matter? Does it predict anything important? So, the researchers looked at how these new identity measures related to actual political attitudes and behaviors. They checked 6 things. Political activism, how much people consume political news, how open they are to political news, their sense of political efficacy, meaning how much they feel they can understand and influence politics, their confidence in their political knowledge, and how much actual factual political knowledge they have. One of the most fascinating findings was about positive identity. They found that when people with a positive political interest identity felt strongly about being interested in politics, they tended to have higher levels of political efficacy, consume more political news, and feel more confident in their political knowledge. This makes a lot of sense. If you see yourself as someone who is politically interested, you're more likely to engage in the activities associated with that identity. But here is the twist. For people who weren't interested in politics, a strong positive identity actually led to lower levels of political efficacy, news consumption, and confidence in their knowledge. This suggests that this identity isn't just about being interested or not, but how strongly you embrace that label and what that label means to you, both positively and negatively. This figure is like a visual summary of their key findings relating to positive identity. You can see these colored squares showing predictions for different groups. The yellow squares generally mean more of the outcome variable, and the dark blue squares mean less. Notice how for political efficacy, news consumption, and confidence in knowledge rose 2 and 3. The interested people with high positive identity on the right side, yellow squares, really stand out. But for the uninterested people with high positive identity, on the right side, dark blue squares, the outcomes are much lower. It shows that simply being interested or uninterested isn't the whole story. How strongly you identify with that group and whether you have a positive or negative take on that identity makes a big difference. And what about the people who aren't interested in politics? This is where the study makes a really important contribution. Most research tends to lump all these disinterested people together. But this study found there's a lot of variety within that group. Some people might be disinterested because they genuinely don't care, while others might be disinterested because they actively dislike or distrust politics. These different reasons for being disinterested could lead to very different attitudes and behaviors. And this identity-based approach helps to uncover that. This is super important for understanding how to get everyone involved in a meaningful way. The researchers also looked at negative identity. While positive identity seemed to have a stronger impact on things like news consumption and efficacy, negative identity still played a role, especially in political activism for those who were already interested in politics. It signals that sometimes defining ourselves by what we aren't can also motivate behavior. Though perhaps less consistently than defining ourselves by what we are, they note that positive identity had better predictive power, suggesting that attachment to a group might be a stronger motivator than rejection of an outgroup, though both can be present. Now, like any study, this one has its limitations. They used data from a specific time in the Netherlands, and it was a cross-sectional study, meaning they looked at people at one point in time. This makes it hard to say why people develop these political identities, or how they change over time. Ideally, they'd want to track people over many years, especially adolescents, since political interest often forms during those teenage years. They also mentioned that this identity is just one of many a person might have, like their gender, ethnicity, or even their profession. Future research could explore how these different identities interact. So, what does this all mean for us? It means that when we talk about political interest, we're not just talking about a simple feeling. We're talking about something that can become a core part of how people see themselves, much like identifying with a team. This identity can influence how much they engage with politics, how they feel about political issues, and even their knowledge. It suggests that efforts to boost political interest might be more effective if they acknowledge and perhaps even shape these social identities, making the idea of being politically engaged more appealing and inclusive. This is a really powerful idea for practical applications. If political leaders or educators want to encourage more people to get involved, they could think about how they present the ideal politically engaged person. By making that image more diverse and relatable, they might encourage more people to identify with it and become more engaged themselves. It is about making the team of engaged citizens welcoming to everyone. This research gives us a much richer way to think about why people engage with politics or don't. It moves beyond simple labels of interested or uninterested and highlights the complex ways we define ourselves in relation to the political world. It really makes you think about your own political identity and what that means for you. That is all for this episode of RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this research interesting, give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below telling us what you think about political identity. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the science of the mind. See you next time.